It's way beyond a pleasure, honour and privilege to introduce Dan. Dr. Daniel Hume is a leading expert in AI and emerging technology. He's the CEO of Satalia, an award-winning and visionary company that provides AI solutions to global companies, including Tesco and PwC. He has a PhD in AI from UCL, where he's computer science engineer in residence. He's a lecturer in AI at the London School of Economics Marshall Institute. He's a serial speaker for Google and an undisputed king of TED Talks. He holds an International Kaufman Global Entrepreneur Scholarship and is a faculty member of Singularity University. He holds numerous corporate and governmental advisory positions. Please welcome the amazing Daniel Hume.
Oh, wow. I can go now. That's the best introduction I've ever had. I'm going to say those infinite words, which is, can you see my screen? First of all, can you see my screen? Excellent, fantastic. And unfortunately, I'm going to disappoint everybody because I'm going to raise more questions than I have answers. But I'm hoping that the panelists are going to be able to help answer some of those questions I'm going to raise in today's talk. So I'm not going to introduce myself because I don't think I could do a better job than what was just done. But I do two or three things. One is I have an academic hat where I'm now entrepreneur in residence for UCL, so I help them figure out how to take deep tech and spin it out. And I'm the CEO of a company called Satalia, which is about 100 people, and we build AI solutions for big companies. And I get the privilege to historically travel around the world, but now from my own home to try and inspire leaders, future leaders, about thinking about the impact of technology on society and maybe even doing something about it. So this talk is going to be split into three parts. The first part is going to be talking about AI, and the second part will be talking about innovation and leadership. And finally, we'll talk about the end of the world, which is my favorite topic. I think that save up plenty of questions for the panelists. They've got an incredible wealth of experience between them, and I'm sure that we'll be able to answer many of your questions. Ordinarily, what I would do is I would take people through this stack to understand data-driven decision making. I don't have time, unfortunately, in this talk to go through this stack, but there are amazing parallels between how we build systems to make decisions and how humans make decisions. And one of the books I'm sure that many people has read on the call is a book by a Nobel Prize winning economist called Daniel Kahneman. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and he argues that we have two brains. We have a fast brain and a slow brain, and as I said, there are many parallels between those types of brains with also AI, and there are implications of having fast brains and slow brains in AI that I'll talk more about later on. But I just wanted to kind of highlight what these fast and slow brains are before I go on. And I'm going to ask you all some maths questions, and your job is to answer these maths questions as fast as possible. That's your job. If you don't answer them faster than your competitors, they're going to take your market. So the first question, nice and easy, and you can answer it in your head or on chat, it's up to you. First question, what's 2 times 2? I'm sure that everybody knows the answer to that. It's 4, good. What's 14 times 768? That's where you need to use your slow brain. So the first one, you're using your fast brain. The second one, you need to use a slow brain. You need to use an algorithm to try and determine what the answer is. Let me ask you another maths question. And again, many of you have probably heard this before, particularly if you've read the book. The combined price of a bat and a ball is £1.10. The bat is £1 more than the ball. How much is the ball? The combined price is £1.10. The bat is £1 more than the ball. How much is the ball? If you knew the answer already, then you'll know that it's 5 pence. Many of you will be thinking 10 pence. It's not. The ball is £1. The bat is £1 and 5 pence, and the ball is 5 pence. The combined price is £1 and 10 pence. This is where, again, we use our fast brain to try and make a decision, and we get it wrong. And AI at the moment is essentially a fast brain. We give it data, it goes through some sort of model, and sometimes it gets it wrong, and that has ethical and other implications I'm going to talk about later on. Let me ask you another maths question. So I've got 5 staff members here. Maybe you can recognize yourself in these 5 staff members. We know their skills, we know their preferences. What we want to do is we want to allocate these 5 resources, these 5 staff members, to 5 jobs. Now, I wonder if anybody can tell me how many ways can I allocate 5 people to 5 jobs? 5. We're looking at one allocation now. I can flip 2 around to get another allocation. I can flip another 2 around to get another combination. How many possible ways can I allocate 5 people to 5 jobs? I wonder if anybody knows. I can't see the chat. I'm just going to open this up. It's, if you remember the exclamation mark from school, it's 5 times 4 times 3, exactly 5 factorial. So there's 120 possible ways that I can allocate 5 people to 5 jobs. Let's make the problem a bit more complicated. I've got now 15 staff members I want to allocate to jobs, and don't say 15 factorial, but can anybody tell me how many ways can I allocate 15 people to 15 jobs? I wonder if anybody, just use your fast brain. It's a big number. It's over 1 trillion possible combinations. So there are over 1 trillion ways I can allocate 15 people to 15 jobs. One rule to take away with you today: anything more than 7, don't use a human for. Humans can solve problems up to about 7 allocations of people to jobs, or delivering packages, or figuring out how many where to spend your marketing money. But anything beyond 7, we're pretty useless. And actually, industry don't have problems of this size, they have problems of this size. So here are 500 staff members. Can anybody tell me how many ways can I allocate 500 staff members? No, you can't. It's a big number. It's a number that's got over 1,000 digits. And just to put this number into context, this is how many atoms there are in the universe. So when you reach about 60 things that you need to consider, again, 60 marketing channels or 60 people to allocate to tasks, there are more possible ways of allocating those resources than there are atoms in the universe. Humans can solve problems up to 7. We can get a good computer scientist that can probably solve problems up to about 25. Beyond that, we're pretty useless. And one of my clients is PwC. They have 5,000 auditors that they need to allocate to jobs. 5,000 factorial is not a number we can even imagine. And again, industry is solving these problems usually using people, and we're solving them badly. The reason why I highlight that is because when we think about technology is broken up now into these kind of 3 parts. The first part is data, and everybody's going on their digital transformation. They're trying to bring their data together because they know that there's lots of interesting insights in that data. And so everybody's excited about this middle part, which is hiring data scientists, machine learning experts to try and find patterns from our data that help us make decisions. Now, it turns out that decision making is a very different set of skills to finding patterns in data. And one of the first concerns I have is industry are hiring lots of data scientists, people have machine learning skills, that actually are not suited to solving these types of problems. These types of problems are called optimization problems. There's a whole different field in computer science to solve these problems. And my worry is that companies are hiring the wrong type of people to solve the wrong problems. In fact, I would argue that companies don't have machine learning problems, they have decision problems. And decision making, as I said, is a completely different field in computer science. It's using insights, it's using machine learning, but ultimately you have a decision to make. And then when we talk about decision making, it also then starts to bring up safety and ethical issues that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So whenever if you touch this technology stack, you're probably calling yourself an AI company. And I think that that's wrong. I think that if you build a system that you give data to and it makes a decision, and tomorrow you give it the same data, it makes the same decision, what you have is automation. It's doing the same thing over again. Now, the definition of stupidity is doing the same thing over again and expecting a different answer. But by definition, automation is stupid. And so by definition, automation is not AI. And actually, there are 2 definitions of AI that I think is important for everybody to understand. The first definition is more popular, but I think is weak, which is getting computers to do things that humans can do. So over the past decade, we've managed to get machines to do things that traditionally were only in the domain of human beings. We've managed to get machines to recognize objects and images, to correspond in natural language. And because humans are the most intelligent thing we know in the universe, when we get machines to do things...
Oui, ça va. Écoute,
when we get machines to do things that humans can do, we then assume that that's intelligence. Now, again, I would argue that humans are very good at solving problems up to about 7. We're very good at finding patterns in about 4 dimensions. Computers can solve problems with thousands of moving parts, and they can find patterns in thousands of dimensions. So benchmarking machines against humans is a very silly thing to do. There's actually a much better definition of AI that comes from the definition of intelligence, which is goal-directed adaptive behavior. Goal-directed in the sense we're trying to achieve an objective. We're trying to allocate our staff to maximize our utilization, or we're trying to put money into marketing channels to maximize our reach. We have to have a goal. Behavior is how quickly can I allocate my resources to achieve that goal. But the key word for me in this definition is the word adaptive. Ultimately, what we want to do is build systems that make decisions, learn about whether those decisions are good or bad, adapt their own understanding of the world so that tomorrow they can make better decisions. And if I was being brutally honest, I haven't seen a single successful complex adaptive system in production in my life. So actually, I would argue that nobody's really doing AI according to this definition. So just to give you a little bit of history, AI in the 60s and 70s was looked like this. This is Socrates before he drinks hemlock. So Socrates is famous for inspiring the Socratic method. So if I say Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, we can infer that Socrates is mortal. And AI in the early days was writing down these rules and then trying to infer new knowledge from these rules, and it never really scaled. And in the 80s and 90s, a new type of AI came along that was modeled on how biology learns and makes decisions. Now, this is the brain of a bumblebee. Bumblebees have 1 million neurons. Their brain can fit on the end of a needle. Humans have about 84 billion neurons. And my PhD was originally trying to model the brain of a bumblebee. So I was trying to figure out how can you model 1 million neurons in a machine and have machines then do things that bumblebees do, navigate 3D worlds, talk to each other, solve problems. They don't handle windows very well, but ultimately they're very, very smart creatures. And 15 years ago, it was impossible to model 1 million neurons in a machine. But over the past decade, actually, we've managed to now to model brains that have hundreds of millions of neurons. Deep learning and other technologies allow us to now model big brains, and we can teach these brains to do things that traditionally only human beings can do. So we can teach these brains to recognize objects in images, correspond in natural language. Now, these brains are very good at finding patterns from data, but they are not good at making decisions. I actually think that the near future is combining these types of technologies, extracting insights from data, with these types of technologies that are then reasoning and making decisions with those insights. And then what we need to do is build systems that adapt themselves in production, which is even more difficult. So just to give you a different flavor of AI as well, if this semicircle here was the bounds of human endeavor, I would probably argue we can take any specific task that a human does, whether it's a decision-making task or a insight extraction task, and we can probably build an AI that can outperform us significantly or almost any specific task. Now, it's very inefficient and costly to build these individual systems and glue them all together. So there's lots of research going into what is called artificial general intelligence. And this is why humans are special. We are one system that can do many things. And so there's lots of interesting research going into how do we build brains that don't just do one thing, but that can actually do many things. And if we take this to its extreme, its logical conclusion, it's predicted that within our lifetime, we are going to build a brain that is smarter than us in every single possible way. I'm sure that many of you have heard this before. It's often referred to as superintelligence or the singularity. And it is the last invention that humanity will create. And we don't know if it's going to be the most glorious thing that happens to us or the biggest existential threat. I actually think it's our biggest existential threat. And I'm trying to figure out how do we mitigate this risk. But this is likely to happen within our lifetime. I won't bore you with this. We can talk about this in the Q&A. Now, when it comes to building intelligence, before we reach superintelligence, we're having to build systems that are making decisions about our everyday lives. And I'm sure that you're all tired of hearing about the trolley problem. I'm in my driverless car. Do I kill a kid? Do I kill a driver? Do I kill somebody else? We are actually having to build these decisions into the systems that we're creating. But I want to give you a question to ponder while I'm going through this presentation. And the question is this: imagine you are sitting on the ethics committee of a ride sharing or ride hailing company like an Uber or a Lyft. And you've just deployed an AI that is trying to understand how to price the surge pricing to maximize profit. So you put this AI into production, and what the AI realizes over time is that when people's battery is very low, they're willing to spend a lot more money on their ride. And so what it's doing is essentially it's identified and it's exploiting a vulnerability in humans. This is not about supply and demand. This is saying that this person is about to run out of battery, and if I price this higher, they're going to be desperate enough to pay for it. Now you're sitting on the ethics committee. Do you decide to keep that into production, or do you decide to take it out of production? It's achieving its goal, it's maximizing the revenues, but it's also exploiting a vulnerability in human beings. What do you do as sitting on the ethics committee? I just want you to think about that as we go through this. So when we build AI systems, actually, there are various different perspectives that we have to look at in terms of building safe, ethical systems. And these, as far as I'm concerned, are the 4 categories that we need to be concerning ourselves that are raised because of AI. Now, we already have well-established ethics committees. We already have a well-established ways of testing complex systems. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is it about AI that makes this stuff different? What is it about AI that makes ethical conversations different, safety questions different, governance questions different? And one might argue that it doesn't. That actually all that AI does is raise questions around where we have to expand our repertoire, our ethical thinking. It's not a separate subject. We have to have a separate group of people thinking about this. It's actually just an expansion of ethics, and that's a question that I think I'm yet to solve, and I'm sure that the panelists have some ideas about how to answer that question. So when I'm thinking about AI and its impact on organizations, on society, I think about these 4 things, and I won't go into the detail because I'm sure that many of these words are familiar with you all. But when I think about AI safety, I'm asking myself, are these systems transparent? Are there biases? Can we explain how these systems are making their decisions? Can we explain how they are coming to their insights? And can we audit the decisions that are being made so we can go back and we can identify where it's failed? For me, the question around ethics is not about transparency and bias and explainability. And I think, unfortunately, we confuse the two. The question for me around ethics is around intent. What is our intent as an organization? Is it to maximize profits, which is a perfectly reasonable intent? But setting those objectives then for the AI to achieve that intent could have adverse effects, like I described in the ride sharing company. So what is the impact of where it will go wrong? And then for me, those questions are ethical questions. It's not about bias. It's not about transparency. It's about intent. And maybe, again, I'll talk more about this later on. So we hear a lot of popular opinion about AI safety, AI ethics, AI governance. And I'm a little bit nervous that we might be getting seduced by marketing hype, as opposed to listening to the people that really understand how to build these systems and what the impact is if we get them wrong. So I'm going to move on actually now. Now we've talked a little bit about AI. I'm going to talk about how AI and technology is going to affect organizations and actually use this as an opportunity to raise some ethical questions. So I won't talk about this, is actually not so important, but ultimately we're not only trying to build systems that are adapting more quickly to a changing world, because that's how you win. We also need to build organizations that adapt more quickly to a changing world. In fact, actually, I would argue that this technology stack that I've been through, that I've talked about, is actually going to become a commodity over the next 10 years. I think that we all have access now to very cheap compute. We have access to lots of free data. All of the tools you need to build million neuron brains, to find patterns in data, it's all free, it's all open source. At some point, somebody will commoditize decision making and somebody will commoditize self-learning. The battleground for companies is not technology, it's talent. How do we attract, motivate, inspire talent to innovate? Actually, Steve Jobs has a really good definition of innovation. He said, innovation is creativity that ships. The most important word for me in that definition is the word that. That is the process of generating ideas and getting them to the point where somebody's willing to pay for it or where it's adding value. And this is not a technological question. This is, how do you motivate, inspire your workforce to innovate, and how do you enable them to innovate? And there's lots of work that's been done on motivation. There's a very good introductory book by a guy called Dan Pink. It's called Drive. And he said there are 3 things that motivate people: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy is giving people the freedom to do what they want, and mastery is giving them the ability to become really good at what they want, and purpose is giving them something higher to align themselves with. I'm going to talk about now some of the trends that we're seeing in organizations, how we're changing the nature of organizations, and how AI and technology is enabling that, and some of the challenges that we're going to have to face into. So there's a very good website and book by an organization called Corporate Rebels, and what they've done is they've categorized these trends that we're seeing in leadership, in organizations, in these 8 categories. And what I want to do is I want to talk through each one quickly and highlight some of the interesting ethical challenges that we might be facing because of technology. Now, the first one, the moving from profit-orientated organizations to more purposeful organizations, is less to do with technology and it's more to do with culture. And interestingly, if you go and Google the values of organizations, what you'll do is you'll come to this website very quickly. Can you see the website that I'm highlighting? Just out of curiosity, yeah. So this is where somebody's gathered together lots of values of lots of different companies. So if you look through them, you've got Accenture here, you've got integrity, you've got Adidas that's got integrity, you've got, I don't know, American Express integrity, you've got Barnes and Noble integrity. You get the point. The point is that these companies have spent millions of pounds on figuring out what their values are, and they're all the same. And this is interesting, actually, because I wonder if anybody can tell me who these values are: respect, integrity, communication, and excellence. Does anybody know whose values they are? Is Enron's values. So you can have the best values in the world. If you don't create an organizational structure, processes that enable these values to emerge, then you're wasting your time. So I actually don't care about values. I care about how do you design systems, how do you design processes, structures, organizations to allow for innovation, but also to mitigate some of the toxicities around this stuff. I won't bore you with the details, but one of the things that I'm going to do over the next couple of years is I'm going to use AI to scour all of the different corpuses of text around, I don't know, religious texts, philosophical texts, other ideologies, and see if there are any ethical pillars that we all agree on. Now, actually, I believe that there are. I've highlighted some of them here. But what would be amazing is if we could get AI to look across all of these corpuses of human knowledge and say, these are the 4 things that we all agree on, and then use that as a framework that we can then measure AI against. AI could help us understand the ethical framework for humanity, and then we could build AIs to make sure that they're aligned with that framework. That's something I'm really interested in trying to tackle over the next couple of years. So we're also moving from hierarchical structures to teams. I'm sure that you all work in many organizations, and I'm sure that you recognize some of the interesting relationships that exist in hierarchical structures. Hierarchical structures, for me, are not structures that allow for innovation. They allow for toxicity, psychological unsafety. What we're seeing are companies moving from these types of structures to moving towards flatter structures. So we're seeing new types of technologies, new types of organizational methodologies that allow us to remove middle managers. I still believe that flat structures are broken. I'm actually interested in creating completely decentralized structures. And what I mean by that is I've got 100 people in my company. We have no fixed managers, no fixed KPIs, no fixed hierarchies. We operate very much like a swarm. Where AI is enabling us to understand our skills, our relationships, who should be making what decisions. And my goal is to not just to scale this to 1,000 people or 100,000 people. My goal is to scale this to a planet. I want to try and create a planet where everybody's free to contribute to whatever they want and be fairly remunerated for that contribution. A world that doesn't have companies, a world that doesn't have countries. So that's my 30-year plan for humanity. We are seeing this happen in organizations, but it's taking a little bit of time. We're also seeing a movement from directive leadership to now facilitating supportive leadership. Now, if you Google what makes a good leader, you see these infographics that say this is what bosses are like and this is what leaders are like. And I would ask anybody, do you know anybody that actually captures all of these different characteristics? And I think you'll be hard pressed to do that. What I would think that we could do with AI is identify in our informal network who are great coaches, who are great at giving praise, who are great at people that you can talk to, who are great at, I don't know, motivating you, and to decentralize and granularize leadership and allow AI to empower those people to contribute positively to the organization. So not to expect one person to have all of those characteristics. I also believe that we can use AI to separate powers of control. Again, I won't bore you with some of those details, but most hierarchical organizations, the people at the top are able to make decisions and mark their own homework. And I think that AI will actually enable us to separate those powers of control to make organizations much more effective. So one of the things that I do in my company is I use AI to look at our digital footprint to understand what skills people have, what relationships they have with each other. So I can, for example, look at my network, my digital twin. I can say, if Darius leaves the organization, I get now a silo between two parts of my company. Now, this actually does raise lots of interesting ethical questions. I can identify people in my company who are going to leave before they know they're going to leave. I can identify secret lovers in my company. The people that have access and power to this information, to these insights, also have a lot of power, and we have to face into that as well. The other one, we're moving from a plan and predict to experiment and adapt, and I think that has been clear. These types of hierarchical structures are not conducive for adaptation. Remember, adaptation is synonymous with intelligent. The more adaptive you are, the more intelligent you are. So what we've seen is organizations bringing new structures like agile and whatnot, and lean structures, new design principles, which brings in complexity to the organization. But the purpose of this is that it empowers teams to decide their own workload, and it also creates more adaptive type structures, again enabled through technology. Again, people will call it AI, it's not, it's analytics, but ultimately we're using these technologies to try to make more adaptive organizations. And ultimately what we're trying to do is create digital twins of our companies. Again, I won't bore you with this, but when I go back to my diagram over here, this is a digital twin of Satalia. I can run scenarios. I can say, if this person leaves, what will happen? I can say what would happen if we hired this person. And I think that what we're going to do is move towards this concept of a digital twin. And this is going to be enabled through COVID. So all of the stuff that we're creating on emails, on Slack, on Zoom will be captured, and that will help us understand relationships, skills, career development, all that good stuff. We also are moving from a rules to more freedom and trust. Now, the reason why I want to highlight this is because I don't believe in using technology just for the sake of using technology. There's a lot of concern at the moment around diversity and inclusion, around well-being, around psychological safety. And the thing what I want to highlight here, which I'm not sure if everybody is aware of, is that if you've got kids or a therapist, one of the things that you will learn about is a concept called attachment theory. And attachment theory is essentially a psychological theory where how you form and maintain relationships as an adult is typically highly dependent upon how your parents behave towards you as an infant, before you're even conscious. And again, I used to think this was nonsense, but when you start to learn about it, you realize that these frameworks actually hold a lot of truth. 60% of the population are apparently dysfunctional at forming and maintaining relationships. If you've been neglected as an infant, you'll most likely form a dismissive and or avoidant attachment style. If your parents have been very hot and cold, maybe they were going for a divorce, sometimes they were there for you, sometimes not, you'll develop what is called an anxious attachment style, where you get jealous very quickly, you don't know what to do to make people love you. 60% of people of the population are dysfunctional at forming and maintaining relationships, and I would argue that these hierarchical structures are breeding grounds for psychological unsafety. And when building, when using technology, when coming up with new organizational structures, we have to always take into account the human psychology, and I wanted to highlight that. So the other trend that we're seeing is the trend from centralized authority to distributed decision making. One of the crazy things that we used to do in Satalia in my company is ask everybody every year to make public recommendations for their salary. So you would all publicly declare what you want to be paid, and then what would happen is people would vote on whether those salaries should be increased or decreased or kept the same. And we would use AI to determine how many votes one person has for another. So if I've worked very closely with you over the past year, if I'm very knowledgeable about your domain, I will have more votes for your salary than somebody else. So what we're doing here is we're trying to use AI to augment human decision making with artificial decision making. The AI is giving you the votes, but you are the one that's making the decision. And this has surfaced quite a lot of interesting insights. First of all, females tend to undervalue themselves. I won't go into the details here, but we had a female that would make a recommendation for her salary, and the crowd would say, "What are you talking about? Go away and increase it. You're worth way more than that." So what this did is it highlighted the bias in her undervaluing herself. And what it did, it mitigated the bias because we crowdsourced that opinion. I actually believe that we can make many decisions in our organizations using this weighted democracy enabled by AI. And of course, it's subject to bias. Of course, it's subject to corruption. But you have to ask yourself, is it better than the alternative? Is it better than having a manager that has a myopic view over your activities and also have a budget that then rubs their hands together because you're not asking for a bigger salary than what you deserve? So that's what you have to ask yourself. Is it better than the alternative? I won't go into the details here. So I'm very, very near the end of the presentation. We're also moving towards a secrecy to radical transparency. So more and more information is becoming available to people. In some respects, this is paralyzing for organizations. So we used to have transparent salaries, and we still do as much as we can. We have analytics that help people understand what they're doing, what they're working on, where they could work, their career development, all that kind of stuff. The hypothesis is by giving more people more information, they can make better decisions. In reality, it can be paralyzing, it can be confusing, it can even produce a lack of trust for leadership. And this is a subject I could talk about for hours. I don't have time, but this is a really important challenge. And finally, I imagine a world where we are not just one job description. We're not just a software engineer, but we are somebody that has many, many different talents. Now, I won't bore you with this. This is not important. But we are today a software engineer, tomorrow a photographer, and the next day a project manager. How do we organize our structures in a way that allows people to have a diverse portfolio of career? Because at the moment, our legislative systems, our organizational systems don't allow people to have that freedom. And again, I believe that this is going to be enabled by AI. But it will raise questions about how do you set job titles, how do you remunerate people if you are a hybrid role. And again, I believe that these are going to be solved by AI, but they're big problems to solve. Again, I'm happy to talk about this. I'm just going to close in the last 2 minutes to talk about the future. I hope that I've kind of convinced you that maybe on the one hand, there is a misunderstanding about AI. And we've seen over the past several years, organizations and governments invest heavily in AI, maybe even misinvesting in it because they misunderstand it. But we need to also acknowledge that AI is probably going to have the biggest impact on our lives, on our organizations, on the world than any other technology. I don't know if anybody can tell me who said this quote, "The nation that leads in AI will be the ruler of the world." This was actually, yes, exactly, it was Putin that said this quote. And I think he's right. Now, I have a problem with the concept of ruler and the concept of win. I think if one organization is winning, another one is losing. And I am worried about this. I'm worried that our economic model is driving us to think about maximizing GDP, maximizing profit, without concerning about ourselves about the impact on society. And I think I've tried to come up with a framework, but anybody that's done business, done a business degree, will be familiar with this framework. It's called PESTLE. It's a way of kind of analyzing macro trends. And many of you will have heard of one singularity, which is the technological singularity, which is when we create a superintelligence. Some of you might have heard of another type of singularity called the economic singularity, which was coined by a good friend of mine, Callum Chase, which is the point in time where AI automates the majority of human labor. Now, the concern is over the next 10, 20 years, we will free a lot of people up from their jobs, and our economies will not be ready to deal with that technological unemployment. I actually think there are 4 other singularities that we need to consider that are being driven by our economic impulses. So the political singularity is when we no longer know what is true. And this is the world of deep fakes and other technologies. Let me give you an example. There was a company recently that trained a machine learning model on the voice of a CEO. and they had the voice of the CEO call up the accounts department to pay for to pay an invoice. There will be a point in our future where we cannot determine what is true, and this will have impacts on our political systems and other things like that. A social singularity is when we cure death, and AI is going to enable us to understand how to what medical procedures to have, how to make ourselves live as long as possible. And there is a hypothesis that we will cure death within our lifetime, and that has lots of implications. There's of course the environmental singularity, which I've spelt wrong, which is when we create uncontrollable ecological collapse, again through probably our drive to increase consumption. And finally, the legal singularity is when surveillance becomes ubiquitous, which is when we can track everybody's digital footprint and we know everything about them. And again, we could talk a lot about these different macro singularities, but I just wanted to kind of highlight there a framework to think about some of the discussions that we're seeing in the news, in the media, and how they map to this framework. On the final note, and I'm going to close, is I don't think that governments are going to solve this problem. I actually think that companies are going to solve this problem. I think companies are going to realize if they want to attract talent, if they want to attract customers, it's not just about making profit. It's about being purposeful. And I think that the companies that are purposeful are the ones that are going to survive. And I hope that the purpose of those companies are going to be solving many of the problems that we're going to face in humanity over the next several decades. The purpose of Satalia is to enable a world where everybody's free to live beyond themselves. I believe that AI could create a world of abundance, a world where everybody is free to do whatever they want. And that's the world I want to create and work with people to create that world. I'm going to stop now, shut up, hand over to the panel.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dan. Absolutely mind-blowing as ever. I mean, curing death, super intelligences, what can I say? Thanks for such an insightful framework for discussing these kind of ethical considerations of AI systems. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Personally, I'm torn between living in perpetual fear of this malign AI singularity and kind of waiting for this utopian decentralized planet. So absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. If we can all show our appreciation for Dan in the chat, thank you so much, Dan. And we'll give you a break and we'll move on to the panel at this point. But yeah, thanks so much. Amazing. So at this point, I am going to introduce the illustrious Richard Foster Fletcher, our charismatic leader of NKAI, who is kindly supporting this venture. It's been a brilliant help. He's going to be kindly hosting the panel discussion for us. So here we go.
Thank you so much, Sam. You certainly do intros that make you blush, don't you? And that I certainly don't feel worthy of. But I'll echo a thanks for Dan. I've got to do a panel. I don't know how. My brain is hurting, Dan, just trying to just follow the last few minutes. So I started with 2 pages in a notebook, then I started ripping pages out so I could spread them out. And now the desk is just paper, Dan. So let's try and crack into this beautiful mind in just a moment. But Dan, fortunately, is not alone in this. We have a wonderful, wonderful panel that I've got the great privilege and honor to be talking with today. Let me tell you who they are. We start with Dr. Sarah Bond, Chief Product Officer and lead the product management team at Miranda Medical. She has an MA, an ME in Electrical and Information Services Sciences from Cambridge University and a DPhil in Medical Image Analysis from Oxford University. Then we have Stylianos Taxidis. You've heard from Stylianos already, Head of Data Science and Products at CDP. This is a not-for-profit charity running the global disclosure system for investors, companies and regions to manage their environmental impacts. Worth mentioning that Stylianos is a believer in augmented, not artificial intelligence, for the creation of a synergetic relationship between humans and algorithms. I'm sure that's something we will touch on in a moment. Then we have Dr. Swann Westphal, who's an acting director of the Institute of Security and Safety at the Brandenburg University for Applied Sciences. She holds a PhD in the interdisciplinary field of linguistics and machine learning. So there's plenty we can get into on that, especially when she lists her expertise as security culture, capability building, dietics, and cybersecurity and international relations. We need about 4 hours, I think, for this. There's so many interesting people on this. And then it doesn't stop. Dekai is here, an AI professor and researcher among only 17 scientists worldwide selected in 2011 by the Association for Computational Linguistics to be awarded the honor of founding ACL Fellow. He's a distinguished research scholar at UC Berkeley's International Computer Science Institute. 2019, he was named by Google as one of the 8 inaugural members of its AI Ethics Council, Advanced Technology Eternal Advisory Council. And then, of course, we met Dan earlier, leading Satalia and working with global brands, serial speaker for Google and TEDx, holding his PhD. Wow. Okay, we're in for some fun. Dan, I've got about 100 questions for you, so we'll see how we go on this to pick this apart. Some of it I'd love to get into more detail on, but I want to allow a few other voices to come through. So give me a nudge if you've got questions. You see the chat down there. Let me know if there's things you want me to steer towards. I'm in your hands here to make it the best possible experience. We've got just under 45 minutes, I believe, unless the organizing team tell me otherwise, to do this. And let's just go back to one of those fantastic examples. And Sarah, I'm going to ask you to help us out with this one a bit more. We heard the example that a user has 1% battery on their phone, and Uber, like you've seen the apps, right? You've seen WhatsApp, knows how much battery you've got. So we know this is possible, and they work out that they can put a surge in pricing. My question to you, loaded question, is if a company's talking about that at the board level, do we, don't we? What does that say about the company and their culture and their openness in the first place, that they would even be weighing up something like that?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is it's not a new problem, and it's not even a problem related to AI. We're all very much aware, I think, as we've tried to book summer holidays, or maybe not quite yet, summer holidays as they once were, that if you go on summer holiday in the school holidays, you're paying a lot more for your hotel. It's the same thing fundamentally. It's that intent of trying to make money out of that disadvantage, as it were, or that kind of restriction that you have, I guess, restriction of having children and having to go away, then the restriction of only having 1% left on your phone. So first thing is it's not a new problem. And I think it comes down to that issue, I think, that Daniel really well highlighted, that companies are thinking about their profit, yes, but also their purpose. And I think fundamentally is, there becomes choice. You can go with Uber, you can go with other apps are springing up, particularly in the US, maybe not quite in the UK yet. And people are making decisions based on purposes of companies. And I think, at some point that's going to come into the thinking of the user in how they make that decision. It's clear that Uber will do that. That kind of message certainly goes out. Companies are about making money. They're about making profit. They have to be in order to survive. That's how the world works. But we do need to have that purpose as well. And I think, it's going to come down to kind of user choice fundamentally. And I think those ethical questions are considered when users look at which companies they're purchasing from.
Sarah, just staying with you a moment longer. It is true what you said, that companies need to make a profit to survive. But at the same time, Apple is rumored to have about $200 billion stored in the bank, which on one hand you could see as an innovation blocker. So yes, that's true. But has it got out of hand, this idea of money at all costs?
Yeah, I mean, for the big companies, sure, I can certainly see that argument. And I think, it's going to come down to judgment of users fundamentally. But I think in terms of judgment of users, but also judgment of employees, I think it was one of the other interesting things that Daniel mentioned is motivating people within companies. Is that a motivation for Apple employees, the fact that they have that in the bank and they're not spending that or using that, paying their employees with that? Or is it more motivating for a person to go and use their talent, as it were, working for a company where that purpose is really genuine and good?
Sarah, thank you. Let's hold that thought, and we've got lots more to ask you about that as well. Dekai, let me bring your voice into this conversation. Nice and early for you, so hopefully you've got a fresh head and some coffee in you to take this. So we've got this big picture that's being described partly by Dan, that some of this is kind of natural and companies will change to a degree, but he describes almost like a revolution But where does something like that come from? Is that consumer-led? Is it employee-led? Is it regulation-led? Or is it just going to be a million micro things that happen over the next few years, and suddenly we find that we've got a very different landscape of working and being a company?
Well, I mean, clearly things are happening as a collection of millions of micro events. There's big breakthroughs in AI that we can point to, but at the same time, there are many types of AI that are not what is, you know, sort of on the media hype cycle, and all of those things are contributing. And I think, you know, one of the things that is arising from this effect is a sudden rush to discuss the ethics of the situation. And within the community, the way ethics is used in AI ethics is actually quite broad. There are a lot of different dimensions, and the same goes for AI safety and AI security. A lot of conflicting definitions. One of the things that I think is really important to look at when it comes to AI ethics is the difference between approaches to ethics. And classically, there are three, very broadly speaking, three different types of ethics that are, on the one hand, sort of a rule-based ethics, what are called deontological ethics, and that's more like the processes that Dan was speaking about. Then there are consequentialist ethics. This focuses on the outcomes, and this is super important because, as we learned bitterly from 3 decades of failure in AI, rule-based systems always are tripping up in the messy real world. The real world isn't rule-based. And so when you start looking at rules, you immediately start getting conflicts between those rules. Isaac Asimov's great body of iRobot stories, dozens of stories, each of them basically is a story about where 2 out of his 3 rules are in conflict with each other. And that's when you only have 3 rules. If you create hundreds of rules, you are constantly in a state of paradox. And so maximizing the outcomes is something that is very important in consequentialist ethics. And finally, there's virtue ethics, which again goes back to Aristotle and Buddhism and Taoism and all, pretty much every single tradition in the world that focuses on the fact that since we no matter how hard we try, and we should, to predict the consequences, to predict the outcomes, nobody can actually manage to do that. It's not a tractable problem. And so we, in the end, still have to focus on virtue ethics, which discuss the individual character of individuals. Then locally, in a decentralized fashion, we're all trying to learn to do the right thing. And as a result, the emergent behavior of the collective hopefully aims a little bit more toward the optimal, even if it isn't. And these are sort of lessons that we had to learn very, very painfully within the field of AI. I think that the ethics questions here are undergoing a similar sort of a pain. So when you hear people talking about is something ethical or not, what are they even talking about? Generally, it's a very confused, muddy, intuitive, fast brain way of thinking about whether something is ethical or not. And it's a jumble between those things. And most people aren't really aware of that, right? The thing is, casually people are thinking when they say is something ethical or not, they basically 90% of the time are saying, did that follow the rules? But that rule-based approach is actually, 1, fairly recent, and 2, constantly straining the limits, right? And we keep seeing cases over and over in corporate governance and many other things where the argument is we just following the rules. And of course, Facebook has been just following the rules. And so over and over, following the rules off the cliff is what we're seeing. And there's an insufficient focus on the consequences. And so, well, how do you judge which consequences are, quote, ethical? Well, that does have to go back to the values and the principles. And even the principles are constantly in conflict with each other. To take Dan's examples, like the principles of freedom are often in practice in in contradiction, in conflict with the principles of not causing harm to other humans. And it's not necessarily direct. You know, my freedom as an American and what we Americans do is causing a huge amount of harm to many other parts of the world indirectly, something that we tend to stick our heads in the sand about. And so, you know, when we talk about ethics, there's a lot of issues already in the real world. When we talk about AI ethics, now we are adding to all those classic problems with the additional dimensions of what AI can do. And it is super important. Yeah, I do want to say something like once or twice I heard the term AI ethicist floated in our various conversations. There is one school of thought that says only people who are ethicists are qualified to talk about AI ethics. This is, to put it bluntly, kind of insane. For a planet where people are not allowed to talk about ethics unless they're ethicists, according to some sort of philosophy canon, is disastrous, to say the least. This is you know, ethics and AI ethics is an issue that the entire population needs to be concerned about. It reminds me very much of our history in natural language processing, also known as computational linguistics. Because when I was a PhD student back at Berkeley in the 1980s, there was a very strong pushback from linguists, and Swann will know this as well. There was a very strong pushback against linguists claiming that those of us who were computational linguists were not linguists, and so we could not say anything about language. I think progress in natural language processing and computational linguistics, you know, things like Google Translate, which I pioneered, and the dialogue systems that we're using in Siri and Alexa and Google Assistant and so forth, have you know, long since proved wrong the idea that you have nothing to say about linguistics if you're coming from an AI standpoint rather than if you're coming from a classical linguist standpoint. The same holds for ethics in spades. So I'll just save my other comments for later.
Well, as you called out on me, I feel you there. The guy really inspired me to go deeper in the computational linguistics part. I think he gave some really great ideas on my PhD. So thanks again for this. I was thinking about this problem as well. I mean, I think, Daniel, in the beginning, you said you'd raise questions. Now I'm going to add more. I'm not sure if this helps, but I try to direct my questions into how can we get everything out there? How can we bring that change about? Because it's change we're looking to, right? We have a change in our societies, a change in everything we do. And AI will rapidly bring that change about. And now the question is, how can we combine that with ethics, and how can we find ways to deal with this? So there are just two open thoughts here, and I want the others to discuss on this as well and have their ideas and insights on that. So there could be either be, this is, I mean, two general ways how change can be led. One could be top down, something like a United Nations regulation. I think you just said people are based on rules, right? So rules are important. Maybe if we give them some rules, they'll be happy to follow those rules because it's the easiest for most people. I mean, discussing ethics is, the quick brain says, right, there's a rule, so that's good. Do we need rules for how to build AI from a regulation point of view? So that would be the top-down approach. Or should we do something bottom-up? Something like we are doing right now. Yeah, discuss about this, spread the word to other leaders. Maybe find some things like with fair trade bananas, right? Put a label on this. This AI, which we've been developed, has been developed along an ethics or moral code. But can I give that to myself, or do I need a certification for that? These are unfortunately more questions I add, but I'd be so curious to hear what you think about this.
Swann, thank you so much. You raised so many wonderful points, that top down versus bottom up. The example I thought of immediately was actually automotive. And automotive is fascinating. They're going through the biggest transformation in probably 100 years, mostly because they haven't accounted for all the market forces. They haven't accounted for greenhouse gases, ultimately. And when pressure was put onto them, they just fought the legislation rather than innovating. So it's been fascinating to watch that. And now many of them are going to lose out big time because Chinese EVs and others are fully forward facing, whereas many big automotive, particularly in Europe, and the US have got one foot in the past. Stylianos, I wonder if I could just get your microphone on, because there are echoes of this in other industries in terms of, one of the challenges we're talking about here isn't just AI, but it's data collection, and the data collection, storage and sale and processing is not necessarily ethical right now, particularly with the big companies. But we are seeing great change in climate and in greenhouse gases and net zero. Are we seeing echoes of that now coming into the data and technology industry that we might have seen perhaps elsewhere in diversity and inclusion, in climate and automotive, who are paying this price earlier perhaps than we are here?
What we are seeing, and I tend to agree with one point that Daniel made in his presentation, that he doesn't think that governments will alter the course of history, but corporations will. And corporations, for me, are social structures. So as money is a social structure as well, and it's something that we all agree between ourselves, and it enhances our voting power as consumers. So what we are seeing is that innovation is getting enhanced. People are noticing different things, and actually corporations are prioritizing different things than just the profit. And that doesn't come from just this decade, right? Some of the theory of constraints back in the 80s said that, is a corporate just a machine to make more money, or is it also obliged to serve the employees and shareholders, the communities and the people working inside it? So for me, we see echoes of people changing. And Daniel mentioned environmental singularity. I agree with it. If the current motivators, because the AI and the whole humanity is going after a very complex or a very simple objective function, which is to maximize our own goals. And that goals are influenced by our social environment. So for me, what we are seeing is a slight change in the new generations, in the social environment, the motivation of the people coming through that. And that comes through corporates, through innovation. I think that we will see a different type of corporate. I had the pleasure of working on a non-profit, which was something new for me, in the environmental space. And I have found people really passionate and dedicated working in this field, which as a talent, they would have a lot better financially positions in many other organizations, but they choose to do something purposeful. So I do think that we will see this in more corporate. We will see, like a good example with the United States regulations, how corporates stayed on track on climate change, on different domains that. And I believe, as a little hint, I think, like Daniel mentioned, swarming. I think that ethics, values, and everything else is subjective to a certain extent to one society. There are some global values. We'll find out of Daniel's research. Very, very interesting. But I do believe that in the end of the day, with swarming, representing all of the minorities, taking out of the bias out of societies, we can find where we stand with the values. An organization can find similar things as minor communities of people. And that's also comes, thank you, Richard, for mentioning on augmented intelligence. I hate artificial because I find it as a term antagonistic to human intelligence. We're here to make things that where the fast brain of a human might stumble, we're here to assist them. I haven't, in my personal knowledge, find one system where there wasn't a fringe case where a human was better than the system I built. And I'm very passionate about data science.
You mentioned linguistics. Thank you so much for that, Stylianos. And it is, I mean, it was just a name, right? All those years ago, just like Brexit. But Brexit's got the word exit in it. Come on, you know, like you got to watch out for these. Daniel, I want to dig in a slight left turn here, but I'm responding as well to some of the questions and comments on the chat. The phrase decentralization has come up quite a few times, and that's linked a little bit to swarms that have also been mentioned. If we think just back to that comment I raised a little while ago, you know, Apple with all those billions and billions in the bank, they're not alone. Alibaba's got so much that a $2.8 billion fine didn't even touch the sides, right, with them. So we know that that challenge with regulation isn't going to succeed if it's just a fine that they don't even feel the pain on. But decentralization is very, very interesting, because right now we're seeing a revolution in finance, where countries like Philippines and Nigeria, Turkey and so on are finding that the micropayment structure and the reduced costs of digital currencies is completely revolutionizing banking, finance and money. And is that, again, is that something that we're going to see coming into all companies, all organizations? What's the power of the force of decentralization on all these arguments?
Yeah, I'd like to think so. So I have to ask myself, I'm a small 100-person company. I have to ask myself, how do I compete with a company that has infinite money? How do I compete with Apple, Google, Google DeepMind? And the answer, so how do you compete with a company that doesn't need to make money? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves. And I think the answer is you can't. So you have to change the rules of the game. So you have to change what it means to be a company. And so my guess is that for companies to be able to beat the Amazons and whatnot, you have to take more friction out of the system. And often that means opening up your innovation. So if you can't afford to hire 50 people, whether Amazon can, for example, to build out your technology, how do you tap into a talent base, a global talent base, to innovate? And so I actually think that more companies are going to be opening up their innovations, creating economic models that allow people from around the world to contribute to them, be rewarded for that contribution. And then Amazon, it doesn't make sense for Amazon to hire 50 people. They have to use this innovation. And so maybe what we'll see is the price, the cost of things going down, because we're able to remove the friction of innovation. And that's really my goal. And I don't think that companies are necessarily the right structure to have frictionless innovation. So my goal for Satalia is actually to decentralize, dissolve Satalia. That's the future I would like to create. If we could take the friction out of the production of goods, out of food, out of healthcare, nutrition, maybe we could make it free or abundant to everybody. And the challenge is, if we don't get the timing right, we'll have lots of people be removed from jobs because AI has removed friction, i.e. people. But if we could get the timing right, those people could be living a world where they don't have to worry about eating or shelter, because it's all free or very, very cheap. And I think that's the promise of decentralization.
Yeah, so interesting. Dan, just staying with you for one more moment. Are we experiencing part of the problem here potentially? There's 52 of us inclusive on this call, which is wonderful. I made free tickets available and contribution tickets available. And I always say, any event I'm involved with, like, we don't mind how you get here, right? Just come and just be a part of it. Do what's best for you. It is honestly fine. But is that model seems pretty archaic. It seems like a kind of pay as you watch micropayment system could be great here. But also, like, things that you're saying, it makes sense surely that we could capture those in terms of the audio, in terms of the text, they could be made available. And then when researchers and companies are dipping into that, again, micropayments, right? Tiny payments are just flowing all the time as something that you did or Swann did that was useful and valuable gets rewarded. Is that anywhere what we're talking about?
Yeah. So this is one of my favorite topics at the moment. But at the moment, we get access to free software, and we're not paying for that software. But what we're doing is we're doing three things. We're giving people our data so they can convert freemium users to premium users. We're giving them our attention, which is essentially ads, or we're giving them data that they can sell to other organizations that can either capture our attention or convert you from a freemium to a premium user. And that's unfortunately how those economics work. But could there be a future where, instead of trying to grab our attention. What we could do is granularize tasks. So you could go and correct a sentence, or I could go and tag an image to get access to Netflix for a month. Rather than having to pay for it, I could be sent a task that aligns with my interests, aligns with my skills, and I'm paying through it through a decentralized work economy. Now, people might say that's a terrible future, but we could create a future where we didn't have to necessarily make money and spend money in those traditional ways.
Daniel, I really love your vision, but we need to define steps towards that vision, right? So we need to find, and that's probably you being out there in the world telling everyone about this, that this might get a few other leaders to change their minds, to try to restructure. But I'm actually just hating the idea, but it is as it is. I hired someone and she's in Albania, and I can't get her to Germany. And but I'm officially kind of only half allowed to employ her. So it's the decentralized thing is great, but we need to find ways to kind of convince regulating bodies, legal bodies. Everyone must get around their heads, and that's a massive big thing to do. Well, and I was wondering whether you have ideas on how to get that change about.
We already have a blossoming open source community. The challenge is we're not able to pay people for their contribution. But if AI could validate somebody's code, or could send it to 4 people saying, can you validate this code? You could pay those people, but you could also pay that person that's contributing to the code. If you can open source your innovation and create an economic model that feeds that community. I know there are several ifs in there, but what I'm trying to do in Satalia is create that model, create that platform that allows people to come together and build innovations.
Yeah, or maybe from the education sector, maybe Dekai can add something to that. What's it from the education vision? Do you think we can educate all future developers, future leaders in the direction of using ethics and AI?
Well, we're trying to do that. I've introduced the AI ethics course at the universities that I'm teaching at, and it's I think it's important. And we're making it, we're about to make it in the very next term, first year Common Core course across all disciplines. And again, I think this is crucial for this generation to be considering. At the same time, there are a lot of issues that are paradoxical. We haven't even begun to touch, on the tip of the iceberg yet for time reasons. And every week I do AI ethics deep dives online where we bring up essentially another thorny conflict between one or more sets of values or principles that we don't like to look at. A lot of this sort of abstraction sounds good in principle, but when you start trying to tackle real problems and people realize, oh, there's this conflict between our notion of free market, free speech, decentralization, lack of regulation, et cetera, versus the kinds of polarization that AI-driven media is producing. And we don't like to look at that problem because it forces us to think about, sort of really hobbling one or the other of our sets of cherished principles. And until we are able to have that conversation as a society, even though AI, I fully agree with Dan, the AI has the power to tackle these problems. The issue is we can't agree on the objective functions. We can't agree on the objectives. And the reason why we as a society have trouble agreeing on the objectives is because we keep trying to look away. We keep trying to avert our eyes from those uncomfortable questions. And until we do, we can't even have a conversation about them. Once we have that conversation, then we can hopefully come to an agreement on what we think the objectives are, right? Because as long as we keep on saying, well, we want fairness and we want safety and we want, et cetera, it doesn't really inform the AI how we want to balance them against each other when they are in conflict, which they are constantly in conflict.
So I did a TEDx talk a few years ago on this very subject, and I thought that we needed to agree on an objective function for humanity. And then what I thought was, well, instead of doing that, could we not give people freedom and abundance? And what happens is if you ask a philanthropist, why do you do what you do? You know, a philanthropist doesn't need to make the world better. But if you say to people, if you didn't have to work, if you didn't have to worry about money, what would you do? The answer is, I want to make other people happy. And my hypothesis is that we don't have to necessarily prescribe that objective function, but what would happen if we enabled us to tap into the creative capacity of humanity, they would be thinking about how to make society better. So we could decentralize the objective function as opposed to saying prescribing one. And if I'm being honest, I keep flipping back and forth. I'm currently on the let's decentralize it as opposed to being prescriptive about it, but I'm happy to be convinced otherwise.
But I guess the problem, just to concretize this, because we get so abstract, and is that, you know, happiness is often psychologically for most people is often heavily dependent on selfish impulses, right? And so when people sort of aggregate what they want to do, well, you know, they're sort of and I agree that an abundance mindset helps to combat that, but ultimately there's still the way we construct society. We create scarcity, we create artificial scarcity, even as we move up Maslow's hierarchy. We even as we're getting up toward, you know, the higher levels, esteem and so forth, we create artificial scarcity around who gets the esteem. And you know, if you look at all these movements today with cryptocurrency and so forth, and NFTs especially, it's all about creating artificial scarcity still, because we're still stuck in our old mindset of this sort of market-driven, assigning value to things based on scarcity. And so unless we get away from that, it's hard to get away from the selfish components of the happiness, which come at, of course, at the cost of others' happiness. And so the AI has to then make a decision ultimately still, if the AI has power at all in a decentralized, so one argument is that if you decentralize everything, the AI hasn't got very much power. Unless you have an AI controlling the decentralization, in which case the AI is the central point, cursive loop here. So if we actually, go with this scenario, there's still a winner take all phenomenon, even under decentralization. In fact, some would argue that under decentralization, you have even more of a winner take all dynamic. Unless you build in something in the system that explicitly tries to defeat the winner take all. So, sort of like there's an objective function against monopoly, right? But then once
why would you have a
society would have to agree on what is the mathematically implementable objective of how much anti-monopolist tendency you want to build into the objective function, right? And so I still don't see how to quite get away from the need for society to come to a consensus as to what we would want the AI, even in a decentralized fashion, to be driving society toward.
Guy, my apologies for bumping in there, but I just wondered, the winner takes all risk from a decentralized system, what does that arise from?
So I mean, there are many cases, so you can run simulations to show that, but just, a concrete analogy would be in a perfectly market-oriented capitalist system, that's an example of a decentralized approach, right? If you have zero government or very, very small government, that's a perfectly decentralized system. And we've already seen it particularly. I mean, I'm in Hong Kong right now, which is one of the most extreme examples of that. It's extremely winner take all.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Capital tends to accumulate.
Probably even today's internet, right? Not much regulations. And who's got the big data power at the moment? A few companies. So if you want another example for that, no regulation at all. That's why I always advocate working with the United Nations and trying to make regulations which are, which make sense and have good ideas behind them and bright minds.
But blockchain's trying to build in regulation into the transactions, isn't it? with smart contracts so that you don't have to have a lack of regulation or governance just because you haven't got centralized services.
Yes, but if we look at blockchain, that's another great example of winner-take-all dynamic right now. The wealth in crypto is not evenly distributed. In fact, it's accumulating to those who got the biggest jumps when they speculated correctly.
Yes, well said. So, Sarah, we haven't heard from you for a while, which is not ideal. So let's get that microphone on from you. I want to ask you about jobs. We've talked quite a few times around jobs. There's upsides and downsides about jobs, but certainly one major upside in the United States is health insurance. And we've seen so many court battles in the last few years. We mentioned Uber as one of them already, about the right for people to have sort of employment, right? That they have access to the things that we consider with a job. So is that the goal, do you think, to keep those same models, or are we holding ourselves back by being glued to this idea that we do need a job with pensions, community, hiring processes, protection, allies, colleagues, the whole lot that goes with it? Have we got to let go of that idea ourselves?
Well, that's a good question. I think what jobs looks like has changed over the last a lot over the last kind of 20, 30 years for sure. I mean, we've gone in general from this idea of your job that you go into for life into much more kind of fluid approach to jobs, and I think people are, certainly in my experience in the company I'm in, people are looking for different priorities when they go into jobs, particularly sort of ones coming out of university at the moment. And going back to that comment on purpose and intent, a lot of people are looking for that in the roles that they go into. That's a much stronger pull than I think it was even when I was coming out of university. So having pension, insurance, etc., as a range of things that are important to you, perhaps I would say less valued by employees as much as their sort of quality of life. And going back to that comment around sort of thoughts around sort of decentralization and that being able to dip into different things and be contributing in the best possible way, I think is going to be increasingly appealing. In my experience, I work in the healthcare industry, which is the whole concept of decentralization would be very counterintuitive to that. It's a highly regulated industry, dominated by big players such as Siemens, GE, Philips. And I think, sort of thinking about those companies and even the smaller ones popping up tend to kind of have similar cultures of highly regulated, kind of very much, what you're going into. So I think it's very countercultural. So I think that transition is going to be tricky for those types of companies for sure.
We talked about getting more open innovation, more crowd ideas. What have you seen working recently in relationships between industry and academia?
Yes, I think the crowd of ideas point is very real at the moment, and I think that's been accelerated by grant bodies and funding bodies. And there's a number of kind of grants available from different organisations that are kind of very much promoting academia or NHS working with industry and putting together ideas, and both are effectively incentivised for working together, which is really positive. So I think certainly there's that crowdfunding of ideas going on there. I think questions then from companies are around ownership and IP, which is a different issue again, and making sure that that's really clear. And I think often the question from companies are, if I'm going to work with an external organisation or an external person even, how do I know I own that, can use that, can sell that? And then in healthcare, owning that IP is also quite important in terms of, you're sort of owning the copyright, where the codes come from, so that it can be checked, audited, and so on by the regulators to show that it's actually doing the thing that you say it's going to do. So yes, in theory, I think in practice it tends to be quite complicated.
If it is.
Sarah, that's wonderful. We're approaching the end of this discussion. You've just opened up another tote of ideas and thoughts from that last sentence. That there's I mean, Dan paints a picture of an amazing future, a very different future. And this is all connected, isn't it? We talk about D&I and climate and AI ethics and decentralization and politics and power plays and countries and companies and all this stuff. I mean, of course, there are no easy answers, but there are great questions. And thank you for raising those. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Stylianos. Thank you, Swann. Thank you, Dekai. And of course, thank you, Dan, for your contributions. I'm about to hand back to the organizing team. MKAI had the opportunity to support this event, and it was a huge privilege to be able to do that. And I see a few familiar faces here today. I see Karen's got a camera, and Odelia and others I'm sure that I can't see right now. So it's great to see you here too. Well done to this team of Jerry, Stylianos again, and of course, Sam, for making this happen. It's their first one, and I look forward to whatever we can do to give you wings to help you fly with this and build your community. What I believe we're doing, and I'll tell them that otherwise, is you've probably heard enough from me, so I'll be closing my mic down, but I guess this is the open mic time of the evening for you to sing a few songs, or even better, continue this conversation, ask some of those questions from the chat, which I'm not smart enough to listen and read at the same time. And we're going to keep the call open a bit longer, but I'll stop the recording so that we can get this up online for reviews and replays. So Jerry, Stylianos, Sam, thank you for the opportunity to be involved. And back to you.
Amazing. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, panelists. Incredible. Thank you so much for being part of it and for giving us the start. Really appreciate it. So at this point, we're just going to do a really, really quick rundown of just what we're kind of aiming to do with this community, kind of what the format's going to be, what we're going to aim to achieve over the next few months, and how it's going to work. So for that, I'll hand back to Stylianos, who will be running through a little bit, and then yeah, we'll round up at 6:30, and people feel free to hang around after 6:30 for a little bit of a chat if they like, but we'll formally close then.
So I won't keep you long. I mentioned that some of that in the beginning of the call. Thank you everyone. For me, it's a moving moment of seeing this first event happen, and a big thank you for Sam and Terry and Richard for facilitating my thought and my initially maybe crazy idea and helping for this to become a reality. This is a community, and for that reason we do want ultra altruistic volunteers. So if you like this thought-provoking event and you would like to participate in some of the private roundtables where we might try to have more specific business questions and answers, problems, and maybe after a glass of wine later on we might go more philosophical, or if you would like to assist us with continuing with this community and thought-provoking events, please reach out to either myself or Sam and Jerry. We will put our emails and contacts in here. Also, you can reach out through the MK community and Richard himself. We try not to overburden him, but a huge thank you for everyone. And also one thing that for all of us is very close to our heart is actually providing, hopefully, that mentorship opportunity for some of the young people, minorities, and people that don't have easy access to that material to help them along their journeys. So thank you very much, everyone. My dear panelists, done so good. And Richard for hosting us. And I will now hand back to Terry.
Oh, okay. Just one very quick closing sentence or two. I heard the legendary Tom Ives about a week ago describe AI as the biggest global collaboration there has ever been. And this mixture of attendees and panelists that we have this evening really proves that's the case. Thank you so much, everyone, and especially panelists and Richard. And this has just been incredible, and probably the best panel discussion I've ever heard. Thank you so much.